Mr Deputy President. That was a smooth change up there, smooth. Mr Deputy President, I rise to lead for the government, for the opposition on the Animal Research Amendment. I'm sorry, I'm just thinking about April 2019. The Animal Research Amendment, reduction in deaths of dogs and cats used for research Bill 2018. The object of this bill is to amend the Animal Research Act 1985 to require a person, as a condition of the person's accreditation as a research establishment or the person's animal research authority, to take all reasonable steps to home a dog or cat that is no longer required by the person for animal research purposes unless a vet has determined that dog or cat is not suitable to be homed. Such reasonable steps include A, socialising or training the dog or cat to ensure that the dog or cat is suitable for homing, or B, causing the dog or cat to be given to a person or animal homing organisation, or C, any other action taken in accordance with the Code of Practice under that Act. The bill provides that a dog or cat is taken to be no longer required by a person for animal research purposes if the dog or cat has been kept by the person for more than 6 months. Failure to comply with the proposed requirement is grounds for a complaint under Part 4 of the Animal Research Act 1985 and may result in the cancellation or suspension of the person's accreditation or authority. Mr Deputy President, from the outset, I'd just like to put on record my appreciation to the Honourable Mark Pearson and his office. Once the bill was second read and he provided his second reading speech, I put in a request to his office and the Honourable Member to provide a greater understanding of the legislation, the bill that he'd put forward. On 2 occasions we met with Honourable Mark Pearson and his staff. They provided me with a briefing note, and it would be fair to say the issues that were raised by the Honourable Member were clearly something that I don't think a lot of people have actually been given consideration to. And I think what's happened here is he's actually shone the light on an area that for a lot of us just hadn't been put before us for a long time, if at all. And I do concur with the Minister in his comments in his second reading contribution just prior to the lunch break, where he said that the Honourable Member, by doing so, has sort of, I think, tested not just the Minister's departments, but probably the whole House around just what this really means. Now, what this legislation really means. What I would say to the Honourable Mark Pearson, after listening to the Minister's second reading contribution, it is very difficult from opposition and generally from the crossbench to get legislation through the chamber. But to have the Minister stand up and say there will be action, the government's not going to support the legislation, but there is going to be action, is actually, he should take that as a victory. It should actually, it's a big achievement. I acknowledge the injection from the Honourable Rick Collis. And not only did the Minister say he had already put in place action, particularly around data, which clearly was lacking, but he's also gave commitments about seeing it through and making sure that the intent of the legislation, even though I suspect this legislation is not going to get up in the chamber, but at least the intent of the legislation will be carried through by the Minister. I think the Honourable Member should be heartened by what he heard from the Minister. Even if he's not going to get the vote of the government's taken notice of the issues and are putting in place some measures to address what has been identified by the Honourable Member. There were a number of issues raised with me when I started consulting with groups about the legislation, and in the second meeting I had with the Honourable Mark Pearson, I raised some of those concerns, and I'm hoping that in his second reading speech, reply, he will be able to address some of those concerns for me in a much more formal way. The legislation currently covers dogs and cats, and you sort of wonder. And sorry, before I go on to that bit, I do actually also concur with the Minister about the title of the bill. Often we don't get a choice in these matters. Parliamentary Council will often dictate what the title of the bill will be, the long title of the bill, but it clearly doesn't reflect what the Honourable Member is trying to achieve with this bill. So I do concur with the Minister. The long title, if you were to read that, probably gives a different view of what he's actually trying to achieve. The legislation currently covers dogs and cats. But I do wonder if there are plans to expand the legislation at some stage in the future, because dogs and cats are not the only animals used in animal research. And so I just wonder what the honourable member is thinking of in the longer term with this piece of legislation. And I'd like him to clarify just what his intentions are into the future. And in my view, it may be that the bill inadvertently captures council-operated pounds. And as such, there needs to be a specific provision about excluding pounds. And I actually wouldn't mind the honourable member in his reply speech giving his views as to how he would see the legislation as it is applied to council pounds. Now, people may wonder what I mean by that. There have been concerns raised with me that animals used in research, dogs and cats used in research, rehomed possibly in a facility that is not a suitable placement for the dog or cat, finish up in the council pound. And so I think we actually do need to, I think that needs responding to by the proponent of the bill. Now, it's also been raised with me and suggested that we should insert the word suitable before person or group with whom to rehome an animal. So rather than just rehoming with someone, it should be a suitable individual. And the RSPCA in particular were of the view that the criteria for suitability could easily be regulated. That is permanent residency, so that animals coming out of a research environment have stable homes to enter, and it also has the capacity to avoid overwhelmed caregivers or even potential hoarders. We often, particularly in regional communities, know the individuals who may have a lot of cats or a lot of dogs at their residence, and well-intentioned. I'm not saying anything untoward about that. They're just well-intentioned individuals, and they keep providing an accommodation, a roof over their head for a lot of these animals, and you wonder whether they've got the capacity to actually meet the needs of the animals. So I'm just wondering about whether the legislation has the capacity to avoid overwhelmed caregivers from being overtaxed with the extra research companion animals that may actually be put into the rehoming network because of this legislation. And also the ability to identify suitable homes for a number of animals. Rehoming is an area that's a pretty specialised area. Not everyone has the ability to rehome a dog or a cat. Not everyone has the size that is required. Like, you certainly wouldn't be rehoming a bull mastiff or a Great Dane in a 56 square metre single bedroom unit in Sydney. I think that would be an inappropriate rehoming of that particular animal. So there needs to be some common sense applied to the rehoming capacities of individuals who are putting their hands up to say they want to be, a potential rehomer. So I'd like the proponent of the legislation. Well, it's interesting that the honourable member. Sorry, I shouldn't respond to interjections, Mr. Deputy President, but I will in this instance. It's a very good point raised by the honourable member. In the discussions I've had with some groups about this piece of legislation, mice were raised, the potential of this to actually be extended to mice. Mice are used a lot, guinea pigs are used a lot, birds are also used in research, and so and just how they are being used is the other thing, and to what extent. Now, the minister raised the issue about data and the fact that the data sets are failed. Like, he went back to his office and asked the department when this bill was second read, just what sort of numbers are we talking about, and they couldn't tell the minister. We actually don't know the numbers that are being used, and so I think that's a really good point. And where does it go to? What's next? And
rehoming homing pigeons.
And so now there were some other issues that have been raised with me about this legislation that I just want to dwell upon for a moment. One of the respondents to my request for input on this legislation said to me that, and I quote, "I'm concerned that the bill in its current form could have unintended consequences leading to adverse ethical or animal welfare outcomes." So essentially, they supported the intent of the legislation, but they're actually concerned about where this will take us into the future, and it may actually have unintended consequence. Something we should all be mindful of when we're giving consideration to legislation. And this particular respondent suggested or encouraged rehoming, the concept of rehoming of research animals being undertaken through an existing regulatory framework. Now, that's pretty much what the minister has indicated in his contribution earlier today. Of particular concern is the prescriptive time limit of 6 months or 12 months with additional regulatory approval, after which animals must be rehomed. That's subsection 3 of the bill. The underlying rationale, we believe, is that the conditions inside research facilities would make animals incapable of adapting to life in a private home if held longer than this sort of time frame. Now, no specific evidence has been presented in the second reading speech, so I'd like the proponent to explain a bit more about the views that are being put forward by this proponent and the concerns. I think that does need addressing. And the issue around imposing an arbitrary time limit. Now, I have had one organisation suggest to me that imposing arbitrary time limits may in fact increase the number of animals used in research, since the turnover will be higher. It's one of the unintended consequences being put forward about this piece of legislation. And I, again, would suggest to the proponent of the legislation that that needs addressing in the reply speech. There's also concern being raised with me about subsection 7 of the bill, that determination of an animal's suitability for rehoming must be made by someone, and to quote the legislation, who is not associated with an authorised person or licensed animal supplier. And there's also nothing in the bill to stipulate that a veterinarian undertaking the determination should have relevant experience. So what they're saying, this particular concern that was raised with me, was that not all veterinarians are actually conversant with the processes of the research facility or the educational facility that may actually be using animals for research, and so, you know, there actually needs to be a strengthening of the wording in the bill about just who is able to make that determination, and what's the experience that would be required. Mr. Deputy President, another practical concern is the lack of provision for situations where an appropriate home cannot be found for an animal that has been deemed suitable for rehoming. And I guess the concern here is you don't put pressure to meet the legislation, you actually then rehome an animal in an unsuitable residence or home, just because you need to meet the legislation. So that's the issue about the arbitrary time limits. And so I'd like to have the proponent of the legislation indicate to the chamber in their reply speech just how they see that to take place. The concern is here just simply to meet regulatory compliance could be putting more pressure on some of these facilities to rehome, and I don't think that's the intended situation that the proponent was putting forward. Mr. Deputy President, as I said earlier, the legislation as proposed by the Honourable Mark Pearson, well-intentioned. He should take great heart from the fact that the government has already commenced action on some aspects of this. He should take great heart from the fact that the Minister has taken on board and is putting in place other actions as well. And I think, as I said earlier, it's not often in opposition, and even rarer from crossbench, to actually get a piece of legislation through this chamber. But to get government to act is a good thing. I'd like the honourable member to address our concerns in his reply speech. I indicate that we will be supporting the legislation if it's put to a vote, but at this point in time I'd also like him to clarify those matters. I think it's important for people who have been watching this piece of legislation and this debate. I think they need to know some of the answers to those things. So we will be supporting the honourable member's piece of legislation.